I remember telling a couple of graduate students that I'd been a client on the original ARPANET back in the 70s, I guess. And they seemed fairly respectful of that. But when I came to ask them whether they knew anything about the state of computing that far back, no, they really didn't know anything at all. So of course, that gives a challenge. How do you get people to understand what the state of computing was 40 years ago? So for a while I was, simply relying on the numbers. Moore's law says that computing power doubles every 18 months, roughly speaking. I've been in the game for 42 years. That's 28 doublings. And 2 to the power 28, it tells me there is 268 million. But what can you do with a number? I have no idea what 268 million looks like. So for a long time I was telling people about the Sherman tree up in wherever it is in the forest there, and saying, if, I don't remember the numbers now, if this tree had grown from a seed in, I don't remember, 50 years or something, it would be following Moore's law. But it never meant anything because, of course, trees don't grow according to Moore's law. The seedling might double in 18 months, but after that it kind of slows down. But eventually, just a little while ago, I came across a new way of describing it. If we talk about the amount of computing power we have now as a football field, then the amount of computing power we had 42 years ago was that little tiny spot in the middle. So you can't see the spot in the middle. Let's have a closer look. It's actually 1/12 of a postage stamp. So you may wonder, well, how, and that's a good deal less power than you have in your cell phone, actually. You might wonder, well, how do you get started with something like that? Well, the Turing machine was the underlying theoretical model, and the Turing machine said that if you have a device that can move tape and make marks on tape and read the marks you made on tape, and if you've got a long enough tape and enough time, you can do any kind of computation. And in fact, the very first task I set myself when I started doing all this stuff 43 years ago was what I thought was a reasonable definition of drawing. How do you get from point A facing in one direction to point B facing in a different direction? Now, looking back, I realized that there were at least 3 ways I could have gone about doing that. One, if I had had any mathematical capability at all, which I never have, I could probably have written an equation that would give me spline curves or something, joining the 2 points under the correct where the correct conditions. Or, being simple-minded, I could have simply built a little library of curves and fitted them to whatever the circumstances were. Or, and this is what I actually did, I could try and figure out what people do when they're faced with that kind of problem. Not necessarily in drawing. I mean, it's very much like the kind of problem that you would have if you had to drive a car off a main road into an alleyway, but you didn't know what direction the alleyway was facing. It's a feedback problem. The one thing you know for sure is that before you can actually go through point B, you have to be somewhere up there where the arrow started so that you can come down in the right direction. So I came up with this system, we would call it an algorithm, in which the angle between the arrow and the main direction was bisected. It would set up a temporary destination, some, whatever it was, 75% of the original distance, and it would start veering towards the temporary destination. And after it had gone a certain part of that way, it would set up a new temporary destination, and start going towards that, and so on. And it worked fine. It all depends, of course, upon the amount of direction correction that can be applied, right? So it'll work under all kinds of circumstances, but it really depends upon being able to set the angle of correction properly. If you have too much correction, then it will immediately, very quickly veer towards the temporary destination, and you finish up with a set of pretty much straight lines, like that. On the other hand, if it doesn't correct enough, then it's going to take a very wide looping path and eventually finish up, as it sometimes did, going around the destination and never actually being able to get there. Now, it wasn't always possible to set the amount of correction that was appropriate to the particular circumstances. I mean, the one where I had the thing doing this, for example, it's very difficult to set so that it would end correctly. But this raises some interesting issues about the nature of algorithms. In the first place, if I left it like this, we would class this as a heuristic algorithm in the sense that it worked okay most of the time. Well, of course, most of the things we want algorithms for, you can't afford to have them only work okay most of the time. If you're doing a fill algorithm, you want to be damn sure it's going to work every time, for example. On the other hand, as you'll see later on, a lot of the stuff I've designed algorithms for are simply heuristic. They work pretty well all the time and very well some of the time. So right now we know something about algorithms. You can have heuristic algorithms and you can have deterministic algorithms. And in this particular case, we really need a deterministic algorithm. We want to be sure that it always gets to the destination correctly. So the last stage in designing this algorithm was to add one feature in which, as it got closer to the destination, the little vectors that it's drawing get shorter, and the amount of correction it applies gets larger. And in that way, it can correct itself so that no matter what circumstances come up, it can always finally get to the destination in the correct way. So that defines another element of algorithms. In this particular case, we're talking about whether an algorithm is capable of self-adaptation. Right? The algorithm is actually going to adapt the way it operates according to what it understands to be the circumstances. So we have a second dimension. On the one hand, we have self-adaptive algorithms, and on the other hand, we have non-adaptive algorithms. Most of the things that you read about in the books, most of the algorithms that you design are non-adaptive. And we value them because they work all the time without any kind of special consideration for the circumstances. And there's one other dimension on which I want to talk about algorithms. And that is that in this particular case, it's difficult to come up. I had difficulty coming up with a term to describe this, but in fact, I'm going to call this an not anthropomorphic, because it's not trying to make things look like people, an anthropomodal design. It's doing what I understand human beings to be doing when they drive cars. And since we don't know of any alternatives, I don't want to call it machine modal, because we're really talking about the software, not the machine. I'm simply going to refer to the alternative as other modal. Okay? three dimensions. Is it anthropomodal or other modal? Is it heuristic or deterministic? And is it adaptive, self-adaptive, or non-adaptive? Three different dimensions in which to discuss algorithms. Now, the truth is I don't normally talk about algorithms at all. I'm doing it today because George asked me to. All of this, the stuff I've been talking about here took place around 1980, just about when George and I first met. And that means it's, what is 2012 minus 1980? It's 20, 30, 40, I don't know, a lot of time. And I don't see any way of talking about that period of time. Was it 1980? Was it that late? Because I started in 68, in fact. This was 10 years before that, before we met, actually, around 1970. As I said, 42, 43 years ago. Can't deal with the whole of 43 years history in 1 hour. What I can do, however, is to talk about 4 algorithms. I've already talked about 1. 3 more algorithms that have been absolutely fundamental to the development of the AARON program. The first one, well, I just wanted to show, if you take my original algorithm from getting from here to there under certain circumstances, and then you reverse the whole thing, of course, you finished up with a closed form. So the first 10 years or so, in fact, were not only spent trying to do things the way human beings do, but were really directed towards trying to understand how the human cognitive system worked. And in this very early drawing, I don't remember, but this was a mural I did for a faculty show in San Diego. And it must have been, when the program was maybe 5 years old, I don't remember. But you can see that it's really dealing with the difference between closed forms, open forms, insideness, outsideness, and so on. And that went on until, I guess, 1979. This was a show at the San Francisco Museum, where the action is with that little turtle crawling around on the floor. The 100-foot mural in the background is just intended as background. But of course, the drawing for the drawing for the mural was contributed by the program. The colouring was contributed by me. The Turing machine model is fine, except that there are things that you can't deal with if you don't have any kind of output device to deal with them. There were no colour devices at that point. So if I wanted anything coloured, I had to colour it myself. Colouring devices started coming in, that is to say, colour displays started coming in around 1980. I don't remember exactly. And
very expensive.
Hmm?
They were very expensive.
Very expensive and not particularly good. But even when I was able to get hold of a colour display, I had this problem. I had no idea how you could get a computer which had no eyes, didn't know what it was doing in that sense. Thank you very much. In the sense of knowing what colours were or how human beings saw colours, no idea how to proceed at all. And it took a while. It took me, in fact, I think until about 1985, and just about the time that Big Blue was beating Kasparov. You remember the computer actually beating arguably the most powerful chess player in history. And I found myself thinking, wait, I think that's remarkable, but I simply do not believe that Big Blue plays chess the same way that Kasparov plays chess. And I started to question this whole issue of whether programs had to be anthropomodal. Now, you have to realize that, you have to recognize that in this period I'd been a guest scholar, that's what it was, I was a guest scholar at Stanford's AI lab, where the dominant philosophy, the whole expert systems thing, suggested not only that we could model what human experts did, but that we could model the way human experts did them. And I started to realize, well, it's not true that we can model how a human colorist does color, because a human colorist does color with a lot of built-in abilities. In the first place, a remarkably sensitive color perception system, and immediate feedback from what the colorist sees there. As soon as you put something down, you see what effect it's had upon the color next to it, and you proceed accordingly. Computer can't do that. At least my computer at that time certainly couldn't do that. It didn't have any eyes. It didn't have any vision. But on the other hand, I thought it does have some capabilities that a human being doesn't have. Human beings actually have very poor color imagination. And I mean that in the sense that almost nobody could describe a set of complex color relationships and then give them to somebody else to do. We don't have the ability to build a model, a color model in the head certainly of any great consequence. And I started to wonder, maybe if I could design a system built around this other modal possibility, built around the abilities that the program, any program does have, the ability to build an absolutely stable internal model and manipulate that model, then if only I could describe what the rules were for manipulating that internal model, I should have a colorist. Now, that in itself was not an algorithm. That was simply a way of approaching a problem. And as far as how I went about approaching the problem, I was still stuck in the expert system mode. It was configured as what we used to call a production system. If such and such is the case, do this. Else, if such and such is the case, do this. Else, if such and such is, and so on and so forth. And it worked. It worked rather well. I was able to do, there were still no color output devices apart from the display, but I was able to, take this one was done from my own coloring, but I was soon able to take the coloring that the program suggested, and at least when I was making a painting, I could use the colors that the program had said. This was one of the very earliest shots straight off the screen, once I had figured out that yes, you can get a computer to do coloring. And to show you what happened when those were transferred to canvas, the first one was the shot straight off the screen. And as you see, I'm really trying to stay very close to what the program had to offer. At the same time, being born and bred, or bred at least, if not born, as an exhibiting artist, I had to face the fact that, maybe I could show some canvases, but I really wanted to show the process. And I had been with a series of drawing machines right through the early part of my career. And I found myself thinking, maybe I could actually build a painting machine, and we could show the painting machine in public. So there it is. That's actually the third painting machine I built. The first one lasted just long enough to show me how little I knew about engineering, and was immediately replaced by a second one, which got shown at the Computing Museum, which then in Boston. And this was the third one that was, in one sense, never shown in public, That is to say, I never did an exhibition with it, but in another sense was shown to a very, very large public because it was the subject of a Scientific American Frontiers program. So it's still out there somewhere. So all of this was done, as I said, with a not algorithm way of controlling the color, but by using this sort of fairly orthodox production system. If then such and such, if something else such and such. And the problem was that as the program became more complex, this long list of if-thens became so complicated and so unwieldy that if I made the slightest change in one place, I was faced with like a month of debugging where things were going wrong somewhere else. And finally I thought, this won't do. I've got to really strip this down and start again. Well, the first thing I realized was that the first thing I thought about was that all of the consequence parts of these clauses, if then such and such, all of the such and suches were RGB triples. They were all descriptions of the colors that were required under these particular circumstances. Why RGB? That's how displays work. You specify a color on the screen in terms of the red, green, and blue components, because you have, in fact, three different guns, red, green, and blue, sitting in the tube, shooting at the screen. Okay. And I thought, well, I don't know what else to do, but it's always been one of my ways of getting out of trouble, that when I don't know how to proceed, I sort of change the terms of reference pretty completely to try and come at a problem from a different position. And I thought, well, at least now what I should do is to rewrite the thing in terms much more like what human beings actually do when they deal with color. These are some of the paintings that were done by the painting machine.
Those 16 colors were
The bottles?
yeah, those are the things.
They're the colored inks. It was a nightmarish proposition, actually. I mean, I must have been stark raving mad to take that on. I mean, you start off with specifying colors with RGB, and then you need enough data to translate that into the 17 different colors which have been designed for the fabric industry. Right. None of them are pure colors in the sense of, that's red. There's something sort of like red, and there are like 4 different sort of like greens. And the biggest problem of all, of course, is that when you're mixing dyes, the only way of getting a lighter version is to add water to it. So I spent months compiling enough data on how these materials behaved to be able to actually use them. Right. Well, eventually that got to be so outrageously stupid and difficult that the machine was sent off to the Computing Museum. It's on permanent display now, actually, in Mountain View. And I bought one of the new wide format printers that were coming onto the market. So now I didn't have to deal with all of the translation from one physical medium to another one. And I was able to go straight from the program to the paper, which was good. But as I say, meantime, the whole issue of this production system getting increasingly complicated so that I couldn't handle it was getting to be hopeless. And as I said, I decided I've really got to recast the whole thing. And we'll do that in terms of the way human beings do. Hue, lightness, and saturation, HLS. So I started, this is one of the first things that I did with my printer. These are some more. And this is really a model of the way things behave for people. If you're talking about the perception of a patch of color, you can think of it as you know, a light source and some kind of filter of some particular color, and what you think of as saturate. So the lightness in the HLS part is a function of the original source of light. The hue is whatever color the filters happen to be, and the saturation is a function of how thick the wad of filters is. So I thought, well, I'm going to rewrite the whole thing in terms if then such and such, but the such and such is going to be an HLS definition instead of an RGB definition. And I started work on this undertaking. And you know, it's not trivial because it was a very long production system by this time. And I woke up one morning with this odd idea in my head. And the odd idea was, in fact, a complete system for controlling color that was so simplistic that I could hardly believe. It was like one of those dreams where you solve all the problems of the world with a block of wood and a nail, and then you wake up and you think, well, in God's name. It was that kind of experience. And I thought, well, that's stupid, that can't possibly work. And the little voice inside my head said, well, you know, it won't hurt to try. And it was so simple that, indeed, it was no trouble to try at all. I got up and I had coffee, and in about half an hour I'd written this algorithm for dealing with color. And I let it run, and to my astonishment, it not only produced results as good as my damn great long production system, but it was producing color relationships that I'd never used, never dreamed of using. Some of them, I mean, there was one I still had, I don't think I ever actually printed it. It was almost completely black with just little arcs of color all over the place. It worked fine. And it was simple. Well, I have to tell you how it works. At least I have to try and tell you how it works. But I can tell you that I've talked about this in giving talks. I don't know how many times now. Every time I have to go back and refresh my memory by looking at the code. It's perfectly simple, but it's so sort of non-human that I can never really remember what's going on. Let me see if I can explain it. In the first place, to deal with the hue, which in many ways is the least important part of the equation. At that time, the program was sort of figurative. I mean that all of the forms were generated from some notion of leaf growth and tree growth. So all it did was to take any random starting point and assign colors to the different parts, as you see down the right-hand side there. So you're really coming up with a series of colors that are related to each other spatially. And actually, I think this was, you'll probably recognize from down the left-hand side, it's actually a Fibonacci series. Okay. Then it divided the whole range of lightness and saturation into three ranges, low, middle, and high. And it picked three random numbers for each of those three ranges. So far, so good. It used the same 9 numbers for both lightness and saturation. Now, each individual case, of course, it has to pick a hue and a lightness and a saturation. And what's happening here is you'll see that each of those two-letter mnemonics there represent the lightness and then the saturation. So in the top left-hand corner, you have a color in which both the lightness and the saturation are taken from the high range. The bottom left-hand corner, they're both taken from the low range. Well, you can see pretty well how you work. You have nine possibilities for any given color, and that's all you have in any given picture. So whatever you're seeing in the picture, in the image, there are actually only 9 values for lightness and 9 values for saturation. Now, does that help? I don't know. The numbers are chosen randomly, and in fact the scripts that it composes for any given picture are also random. What this script is saying is that 70% of the no matter what the color is, no matter what the hue is, no matter whether it's a leaf or a branch or a sky or anything else, 70% of the time you'll choose the lightness from the high range and the saturation from the medium range. 20% of the time you'll choose the lightness from the medium range and the saturation from the low range. Right? And 10% of the time they'll both come from the high range. That's it. That's the whole algorithm. And it worked. Worked so spectacularly well that it's still in use today. You know, after having written it in about 15 minutes and almost not modifying it, it's still in use today. That's the algorithm that gets used. Now, in the terms of the three dimensions that I talked about before, this is manifestly not an anthropomodal form. It's an other, I'll call it an other modal form. No human being in the world could ever manage the colors in a painting by using this kind of system. Okay? The other properties, it's not a deterministic model. It's what I call a heuristic model, in the sense that everything is pretty damn good and some things are marvelous. Right? And in the third thing to say about it is that it is not self-adaptive. It is not self-adaptive. It treats everything in exactly the same way. It never modifies its performance at all. Okay? As to trying to understand what it's doing, just try and imagine for yourself, looking at these numbers, if you could imagine what the difference in the color composition would be for each of these 3 scripts. If you can, I have to tell you, I cannot, except in the very broadest possible terms. So this is probably the most, if I had to pick out one element in 42 years of work that I thought was remarkable, this would have to be the one. I mean, where it came from, I have no idea. Why it works, I have no idea. There's no question that this stupid little algorithm embodies an enormous amount of knowledge. I mean, you know, you couldn't come up with an algorithm that works this well by accident. So, you know, half a lifetime of experience as a colorist, somehow or other, has found its way into this other modal form. And as I said, if I had to pick one single thing in my whole career that I regard as remarkable, this would have to be it. And it resulted in some quite, I think, stunning pieces. These pieces were all printed. Some of them were simply published as edition prints in the orthodox sense. A lot of them were mounted permanently on rigid boards and then sprayed to protect them, so I didn't have to put them behind glass. But as you see, the program is capable of a great much more diversity than I ever used, actually. I mean, it could produce enough different color signatures, so to speak, to satisfy a dozen different artists. I just wanted it to satisfy one artist, and in fact, it uses a fairly limited range. You know, some of the scripts it uses, I just picked the ones that I want to keep going with. I haven't actually changed that for quite a long time now. So we're compressing time here because, you know, my first move into color was around 1985. I moved from the painting machine to the wide format printer in 2000. So we were sort of coming up towards the present here. As you can see, I mean, I'm showing you these in sequence. A large part of what was on my mind, this, I don't remember, this must be, oh God, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. No, much more recently, 4 years ago, whatever. I was trying very hard to kind of simplify have the program simplify the image. And then something happened that sort of stopped me dead in my tracks for a little while. All turned out well in the event, but I got a call one day to ask me if I would take part in a closed competition for a big public art project. Well, I can never resist the temptation. The public art project was for a piece of hanging sculpture that was going to be in a big administrative complex in San Diego. There were actually 5 new buildings going up, and they wanted one for each entrance hall. So I spent about 6 months, I think, trying to figure out how I could, you know, as it were, take apart one of AARON's pieces, then reconfigure it the way the program had suggested, things overlapping each other, things actually occupying 3 space. And there were a lot of difficulties. It was technically quite difficult because you didn't want to finish up with one panel going through the middle of another one. So I devoted about 6 months, I think, to that project. And when everything was said and done, they reduced it from 5 to 3, and I didn't get one of them, which is all right. No, it wasn't all right at the time. I was a little unhappy at the time. It all worked out all right in the end. But I was left with nothing to show for this except for these little panels that I'd made, showing the front and back, or at least showing 2 views of the suggested piece. There were a lot of them. I mean, you know, once the program was running, it could generate new pieces of sculpture at the rate of about 1 every 2 minutes. So I had a number of these little panels. And finally, I sort of cut them up because I didn't see why they had to be in doubles like that. And I was sitting around feeling quite glum in my studio, looking at these stupid little panels, thinking, and finally thinking, you know, I can't stand those white and grey backgrounds. Having nothing better to do, why don't I just paint them a different colour? So I pulled out all my old paints, which had been in storage for about 10 years, at that point. And I started painting over the backgrounds. And the most astonishing thing happened. The whole identity of the image changed. And I thought, well, this is sort of interesting. I mean, I could no longer tell which had been painted and which had been printed just by looking at them. So I did another one. And I thought, you know, there's something going on. I don't know what it is, but there's something going on here. And at that point, I was in the late stages of preparing for a show in London. I had all these works sitting in my studio. They were all, as I described, they'd all been mounted on rigid panels and sprayed, ready for exhibition. And I started painting over them. And the more I painted over them, the more I thought, this is an extraordinary thing going on here. I don't know what it is. I started to think it's got something to do with the actual making. I got very involved with the issue of making the thing. I thought this is part of what the viewer reads in an image when he sees the manipulation of material, and it carries with it at least the implication of intentionality. But I went on doing these. Some of them, in fact, did finish up in, I think most of them finished up in the show in London. And eventually, just going over the things that the program had already done didn't seem quite appropriate, so I had to start working on the program to generate stuff that was intended to be an underpainting. And that's pretty much where things have, well, not quite, but close to where things have got to today. But these are examples of pieces that have been all painted over. Okay, that brings me then to what happened since I started painting. I'm now back in my studio, actually gainfully employed, instead of just staring at the wall. I'm trying to remember where I was before this whole 6-month fiasco had taken place. And one of the things that occurred to me was that, and this is developing the third of my 4 algorithms, one of the things that occurred to me was that in the same way that the coloring, the pre-algorithmic coloring system, the production system, had become very, very complex. In fact, the way that the program was generating forms had become very complex too. I think I've got, no, never mind. If you look back on the old ones, in fact, you can see, if you look for it, you can see that there are a number of different kinds of leaf forms. The forms are modeled on the way leaves actually grow. And there are several different kinds, and they grow in several different ways. But each one had to be specified very, very precisely. It wouldn't always produce the same leaf. It would produce a whole family of that particular kind of leaf. But again, the amount of code that had to be generated to add something there was becoming sort of aesthetically unsatisfactory. And I started to think, I wonder if there's some other way of generating forms that would bypass all that high level of specificity in the thing. And I came up with this slightly Darwinian notion that all of the forms, in fact, could be constructed from some very small primitive, and that the difference between one kind of form and another kind of form would depend upon the local rules for the way those forms, those little cells, could accumulate. So that in this particular case, you see that they follow the rule that each one can only add on to the one that's been done previously, that's been added previously, and there are some local rules about the direction of growth at each particular stage. Okay. Then calling on the algorithm with which I started this talk, the program then draws a line around the whole agglomeration, and calling on yet another algorithm that I've been using since the early days, it then fills it in. And given a different set of accumulation rules, you come up with a different kind of form. And so on and so on. So what do we say about this algorithm? It's certainly heuristic. It doesn't guarantee that everything it does is going to be okay. In fact, there are certain configurations in which, because of the way that the cells agglomerate, there will be gaps between them. There will be a huge bunch of cells, but it will only find one or two at the top. So it works well most of the time. It works extremely well some of the time. It's a heuristic program. It's also an other modal program. Right? Nobody in the world would, if they were painting and inventing forms for themselves, nobody in the world would go about it this way, and probably couldn't, actually. You couldn't hold the thing in your mind well enough to do what the program is doing. And for the third dimension, it's non-adaptive. It doesn't adapt to the circumstances at any given point. The result of that was a series of, that came in the next stage of the painting, when the program was, as it were, designing the underpainting rather than just giving me finished works to modify. So that gives me a number of paintings. All of these were in the show in London. These are quite large, like most of them about 4 foot by 6. And that leads me then to the fourth algorithm, which isn't fourth because it's last. In fact, this is an algorithm that I've been using for a long time now, and it's been a very successful one. But I left it to last because it's the one that happens to be most on my mind at this place, for reasons that you'll learn in a moment. How do you place material into a frame? Well, this is my wrapping algorithm. It starts with any point at random in the frame. It then places the next point some distance from it and at some angle in relation to the frame. So the A there is the angle, which you can set. D is the distance. And when the next one falls off the frame, it simply wraps up to the top and completes the distance that way. And similarly, when it reaches the end of the picture, it goes back and starts again at the beginning. Now, if you think about it, if A is constant throughout this process and D is constant throughout this process, you would expect to get a fairly regular configuration, although you might not expect it to be quite as regular as you would actually get. So you don't keep both of them constant, you keep the angle constant, and you allow the distance, which is specified as some proportion of the height of the picture, you allow that to vary, and in this particular case it varies between 25% of the height and 75% of the height. Well, in those cases you would expect to get something approaching not a random distribution, but the kind of distribution that I'm really looking for. What am I looking for? I'm looking for, if I can go back a couple here, I'm looking for the kind of clustering that you see in this image. It's becoming increasingly clear that the individual forms have to be right, but the way they cluster into groups is absolutely critical to whether the image is going to be effective or not. So when I'm applying this wrapping algorithm, notice, if the angle was so close to the vertical that it only got through one spread by the time it had drawn enough elements, you wouldn't get anything very much interesting with relation to clustering. But if the angle is wider, so that it has to go backwards and forwards 2 or 3 times, and you don't know where it's going to start all this time, the forms are going to cluster in a much more interesting fashion, like these. But I didn't realize that I'd actually been rather lucky in my use of this, because for this talk, when I came to examine the distribution of points here, I found to my astonishment that given certain angles in relation to the actual width of the picture, you got very predictable results. In this particular case, what does it say? The angle is, this is in radians, 0.68. The distance is, as I said, random between 1/4 and 3/4 of the height of the picture. And for as long as I kept this thing running, it would persistently keep drawing things in pretty much straight lines at the angle that had been specified. Now that's peculiar, that's the angle that does this, and I discovered 2 of them for this particular frame of reference, this particular rectangle, going to be different for any other proportion of rectangle. So this algorithm has to be tuned with some care. You have to specify, you have to know in advance what numbers to beware of for any given rectangle. Okay? So what do we make of this algorithm? It's much, it's heuristic, certainly. It's sort of other modal, because not that nobody could do it, but nobody would do it, I guess. And it's non-adaptive. Okay. There's another one with the same angle. Again, you get these lines coming down. The angle in this particular case is just under 40 degrees, I think. But it was effective enough. As I said, I've been using this for years, and all of the stuff that I'm doing now is based upon the various algorithms that I've talked about. These are all using the wrapping algorithm for placement. They're all using this form generating algorithm. And as far as the drawing is concerned, they're all using this algorithm that I developed back in 1970 or whatever it was. As I think you can see here that the clustering is a very important issue it's certainly an important issue for me here. So I started to wonder, not very long ago, I wonder if I can actually pull something out of the clustering issue in such a way that the program could actually predict from the way it had clustered the things that the program could actually predict which of some batch of samples I would want to go ahead and develop. Well, my instincts told me that they would be the outliers. That if I generated 100 images and decided to work on 5 of them, those 5 would be quite unlike all the rest. But unlike in what regard? I didn't know. In fact, I have no mathematical capabilities to speak of at all. I didn't even know how to approach the problem. On the other hand, my son quite literally wrote the book on, what is it called, Statistical Methods in Artificial Intelligence. Not a great thick thing. I couldn't understand the first page of it. And I decided that I would consult with my son on this. So in fact, we spent about half of Christmas Day with him trying to explain to his innumerate old dad the simplest concepts of statistics, and finally gave up any hope that I would understand well enough to do anything, and volunteered to take a hand. He said if I would send him some data, he would run the data and tell me which the outliers were. So, all right, I set up the program to, what was I going to measure? Didn't know it. But I thought, I can have the program keep track of the numbers of the clusters. In one case, there might be like 3 single elements plus 2 groups of 3 elements, clusters of 3 elements, and 1 cluster of 10 elements. Don't know. And I let the program run overnight, and the following morning I had data on 300 images, which I sent off to my son. And meanwhile, I went through the 300 images myself and picked out 15, which I thought these are ones I'd really like to develop. And then I waited patiently for Paul to send me the results of his analysis, and it came 2 days later. And I would like to report that he had predicted all 15 of the elements. I would be delighted to report that. I'd be quite satisfied if he'd predicted 10 of them or even 5. But truth in advertising prevails, and he picked 1 of them, which he told me was not statistically significant. Well, it wasn't, but something rather peculiar showed up that I still don't understand. I then did 2 or 3 little tests of my own. I don't remember even what they were. But curiously enough, the one that he picked up showed up in all 3 of my tests, and I don't know what it was doing. Yeah. But whether that's statistically significant or not, I don't know. The truth, of course, is that I should have anticipated this not statistically significant result, because I was fully aware when I was doing the selection myself that in the first place I was having to guard quite carefully against simply looking at the clustering and picking out what I thought were interesting clusterings. I wanted the image as a whole that I thought would be worth continuing with. And I realized that in one case I found the color combination extremely interesting. In another one, the image seemed to evoke something for me that was quite peculiar to that image. Each of the 15 images seems to have been arrived at, my selection seems to have been arrived at for a rather different reason, in fact. Now, when I told my son about this, he said, well, he didn't think it was really fair to design one test on the basis of one set of criteria and then test it against a different set of criteria. And I had to tell him, well, actually, that's what we do in art all the time. art is really the technology of emergence. You don't know when you start a painting where you're going to go along the way. You may have some destination, vaguely formed destination in mind, but you don't know how you're going to get there. And all kinds of things may come up along the way that will change your direction. Michelangelo famously, if truthfully, I mean whether it's really a true story or not, claimed that the figure was already inside the block of marble and all he had to do was to remove the excess, which shows him to be a rather smart operator. But the truth is, of course, that no, he didn't know exactly where the figure was inside the stone. He didn't know what material had to be removed until he'd removed some of it and looked at the result. But there's a constant feedback going on between the act of making something and how you proceed with the making after that point. So, as I say, in some ways we might regard art making as the technology of emergence. It's what emerges in the making of an image that is going to determine what finally appears, or help to determine what finally appears there. Now, in fact, that probably covers the whole of art history, until a few oddballs like me came along and proposed that a computer program could make art. Moreover, that the computer program could make art without actually looking at what it was doing along the way. Now, no human being in history has ever created a painting without looking at it as it's going along. And if we're talking about a human being, no painter could look at what he's doing without recognizing things that are happening that are going to predict the following course. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with an algorithmic approach to making art. It just happens to be not what I appear to be interested in at this moment. But I am aware that, as I've said, I've told you about 4 algorithms. They've all, the first one was anthropomodal. All of the more recent ones have been other modal. They've been constructed around what a program can do, not around what a human being can do. They've all been heuristic in the sense that they, which is fine, which is that they produce good results all of the time, excellent results some of the time. But none of them have been other modal. Sorry, none of them have been what are we talking about? None of them have been self-adaptive in the way that very first one has been. And here I'm saying I'm interested in a way of making art that is fundamentally self-adaptive. Now, is a program capable of doing that? Well, we don't know. We don't know because it's never been done, and we're a very long way from being able to do it. But it seems to be sort of where I'm stuck at the moment. I also don't know whether the whole question of algorithm design is central here, because, as I say, we're talking about uncharted territory. But I must say that at this point, I would very much like to discard my wrapping algorithm for placement with an algorithm that, as it were, felt its way towards an appropriate clustering, so that it was, not that it was less heuristic, but so that it would actually be able to feed back from what it's doing to move closer to what it wants. The problem, of course, is that I don't quite know what it should want. I still don't know, after using this algorithm for some years, I still don't really know what constitutes the excellent, what characterizes the excellent examples in relation to all the okay examples. But maybe I'm not quite stating the problem in the right kind of way, because it implies that I know what it is I want. I think really what I should say is that I want an algorithm that is capable of monitoring what it's doing as it goes along and discovers what it wants as a final configuration, as a final state of clustering. Is that possible? I don't know. But if I manage it, I'll be sure to let you know. Thank you so much.
So, let me ask a question and maybe a mix of comments also. What I was, one of the big questions for me is the aesthetic resolution, or when is something aesthetically right? And when you have a camera and you try to make an interesting photograph, you move around, continuously move around until everything is in place with the image, and you have a kind of formula in your mind. You take the picture, and then you do it again, and then after looking at 100 of these pictures, sometimes you discover unintended solutions or situations. And in some sense, the conversation of aesthetic decision of when is the image right seems to be here partially in the program, but in the end, without you deciding which one is the right one. In other words, you have a big key component. And so I was just curious, is there like a success rate, for instance? Success rate?
Mm-hmm.
Does every picture fulfill the aesthetic conditions that you're after? And you're looking at kind of the software, and you design the software. And you're looking at what it does, but at the same time, you have a set of expectations. And as you said, that set of expectations evolve and grow. So every time I take a photograph, I learn from that image, and will determine what I'll be looking for. So I'm just kind of, the reason why I asked this is because you didn't really address the order of the ones, right? How to organize them. As a photographer, that's been very crucial in my approach. So, are there, I guess, how do I pose the question? So, yeah, is there such a thing as a success rate? In other words, 20% of the picture, or you've already answered that by saying 80% of them do it well, 90% do it very well. So how do you decide if the software is operating as you wish?
Well, I think, excuse me, I think the issue of clustering is the central issue, in fact, and corresponds in some ways very closely to what you're talking about. I want to give the sense of something seen. I want you know, if we were talking about it generating material that one finds in the real world, trees, plants, rocks, whatever, I would want to generate the sense that I actually saw this. This was what it was like when I saw it, which is sort of what I think what you're talking about when you're looking for exactly the right place from which to photograph something. Sometimes it looks just like an arrangement, and sometimes it looks so inevitable it couldn't have been anything else. I think the issue of clustering has to do with, and do understand that I'm guessing here, the issue of clustering has to do with the way things actually happen in relation to each other in the normal visual field. That a lot of the time things seem to be just randomly placed, but sometimes things come together in an odd kind of way that you'd never noticed before. And I think that's what the clustering is aimed at here. Now, whether that's not all of what's covered by the term aesthetic, of course, which is one of the two words that I try very hard never to use. The other one is creative. Not very successful in not being able to use them, but I think of it in sort of practical terms rather than aesthetic terms. I do have this sense of what I want the thing to be like. I can't tell you in words. Right? You can't tell me in words when you pick out this one image out of 50 that you think really gets it, what it is about that is different from the other ones, but you recognize it when you see it. And I'm trying to find out what it is about the ones that I really think are marvelous. As I said, it's not all of what's covered by aesthetic. There's also the color issue. There's the question of how the thing is rendered. I mean, the difference between this one and that one has a lot to do with how much of the ground is actually covered. Certainly has a lot to do with the clustering. I mean, it is central. But there are lots of other things going on. It's just that I'm talking a lot about clustering because, as I said before, it happens to be the one thing that I'm most fully occupied with at this point.
When you, maybe to rephrase George's question a little bit, when I hear what you're speaking about, I think about it as a designer looking at a performance criteria of the algorithm. So when you talk about clustering, and when you let it run overnight, I'm thinking that you have overnight, the metaphor that I've heard before that designers make is that they create a set of children, and then their act of selection is the art of the kind of this unquantified aesthetic choice. Like that is the final design hand that selects everything. And but I wanted you to clarify a little bit more about the kind of the selection aspect and clustering, because when you talk about the grouping, I'm more trying to understand how I would select that grouping specifically, like naming the types of grouping, so that I would create a kind of a hierarchical criteria on what I believe is successful. So I guess could you maybe go into the deeper meaning of what clustering would be?
No, I'm not sure I can answer the question. I am aware of a fundamental difference between the way a designer goes away about viewing a problem and the way, I don't mean this in a hoity-toity sense, but the way an artist goes about viewing the problem. It would never occur to me to want to give names to different classes of clustering. For example, I would never be interested in having a hierarchy of those things. I'm having a hard enough time. There's only one thing I want, and that's something that has this, you know, as I said before, when I started painting over images, I thought that one of the, what was happening was that I was introducing making as an important element here. And it's important in the sense that when the audience sees the act of the hand upon the physical material, that carries an implication of intentionality. And at that point I was thinking, yes, well, the problem with all of the stuff I generated without painting over it, perfectly okay, but it didn't have that sense of intentionality. It's something that had happened. More recently, I'm inclined to think that's a very shallow view of what's actually happening. And I think by taking over the painting of the thing myself, allowing myself into this process of continuous observation of what's happening, and then changing direction as needed, spotting something that I hadn't realized was there and acting on it, is actually introducing real intentionality, not the appearance of intentionality. The intention, if I have to give any words to it at all, and I only do this because I'm giving a talk, what else am I supposed to do? I would say that I'm trying to create the sense of something seen, something that has the inevitability that, in the same way that Van Eyck writes at the bottom of the Arnolfini portrait, I was here. I want to include that sense of inevitability. I know it's true because I was there, I saw it. That's the kind of feel that I want the images to generate. I don't know how much of that is accounted for by the clustering, but I'm quite sure that a large part is. I don't know how the clustering then relates to other things going on in the painting. But I'm a bearer of very little brain and I can only think about one thing at a time. Not quite true. But at the moment, clustering seems to me to be an important, perhaps the most important single issue. And as I said, I really want to see if I can find a way for the program to deal much more interactively with what it's doing, much more other-modally. No, sorry, much more self-modifying in what it's actually doing. I don't know whether that answers your question at all, actually, but
I think what, yes, it does. And I think for me, coming here and trying to fit myself into my split personality as a designer to kind of an artist, programmer, technologist, however you want to describe it, there's still that little gray zone of aesthetic and also going really deep into naming terms that are still left undefined. So when I think of the word like beauty or patterns, I have to go a little bit deeper to find out my desire to make it, even if it's algorithmic. So, but if I left it as an artist, I would say this is my attempt at kind of at a global level. But as a designer, I want to go even deeper and say, well, what is that like intangible thing that I'm trying to describe, which is probably the frustrating thing for me, is I'll bang my head on that. So, so I guess I understand your answer, but I'm just trying to find out the little nugget of the cluster, and then
Yeah, well, I think, I think we share that. It's just that the naming is less important to me than the identification. I mean, but identification in the sense that I know what it is.
Exactly.
Not only do I know what it is, but I can actually tell the program how to get closer.
Exactly.
Mm.
Latching on to identifying and naming. I prefer modal, I like that word. And also other modal, but I think there's a very blurry line between them, and you were both strict in defining other modal, but also in another instance very flexible in defining and setting it apart from anthropology. For example, with the hues and the saturation, it's very clearly, it's not apples and oranges because you don't think that way. But I think you do think that way. Where do you draw that line? Apples and oranges with other model, whereas then dealing with other models, pretty flexible. We could think this way, but we wouldn't think this way. So it's really blurry, and when you kind of resolve it, you're defining terms, and then when is one not the other?
Well, you're quite right, of course. The coloring algorithm is quite distinctly other modal. No human being in the world could use that method to paint a picture.
I mean, even if we're thinking about, maybe I won't say I want 70% of this hue, but I would think I want a higher amount of this structure. Is it just the matter of the number? Thinking with the number that sets it apart?
No, because a human being couldn't do it because, we could do a simple test. I could show you any one of those patches of color on the image and ask you to tell me what the saturation was and what the lightness was. And believe me, you couldn't do it, nor could I. So, if I gave you, if you said, well, I'm going to do it the same way, and this requires something at this position on the color wheel, the hue, and I want it to be, a saturation of 0.3 and a lightness of 0.7, believe me, you wouldn't get close, nor would I. No, there's no question, I think, of how other modal the coloring algorithm is. On the other hand, my wrapping algorithm, yeah, it could be done. Could be done by anybody. Once the program had decided what the rules were, you would have to find some way of guaranteeing randomness in the distance in each case. You would have to construct the thing. Nobody would do that, but yes, you could do that. The form generating algorithm, I think, is more other modal than that. Could you do it? Not sure. I'm sure nobody would. But whether you could, as a test, actually generate interesting forms. The problem would be that you would have expectations and you would modify your own behavior. If you wanted to wrap a complete set of cells, you would be very careful not to allow divisions between them so that some were ignored, for example. So the human mode, the anthropomodal form there, would really have a rather different result. You can't escape your own psychology there. So, in some senses you could do the same thing, but in practice you really couldn't. But you're quite right. I mean, some of these algorithms are much more other modal than others. I use a rather marvelous fill algorithm that I didn't invent. It is given a string of cells that describe a closed form. It's a one-pass algorithm. You go around once, and when you finish, it's all filled. Pretty good. It's disappeared from the literature. And in its place, you have two quite distinctly anthropomodal forms. One is this line scan algorithm. Right, well, anybody can do that. You just go across, and you start filling when you hit the edge, and you stop filling when you leave the next edge. Right, you can do that. The other one is slightly less so. It's a recursive fill algorithm where you just keep repeating the same thing until the whole thing is filled up. It would be very difficult for a human being to do that because a human being couldn't keep track of where it had been. Right? So again, you have this sort of slight, I agree with you, slight fuzziness about where the boundary comes. I'm really only interested in the other modal ones at this point.
So, this is a great place to stop. Thanks for coming and sharing the work of 42 years in
And counting.
It's great to-